DUPS Discussions. This week we're speaking with Dr. Chris Benwell. And as always, make sure you check out our socials. We do post about Instagram, like who we're speaking to on Instagram the day before. So you can ask any questions you find relevant or anything you want to know on there as well. So I guess like a starting point would be, what is your main research area and what is your main role at Dundee University?
So my role at Dundee is I'm a lecturer in psychology, and my main research interests are very broadly in psychophysics and EEG recordings. So originally I did my PhD, and my initial research focused on EEG recordings during performance of visual perception tasks. But in more recent times, I've sort of moved from low-level visual perception to be interested in sort of higher-level cognitive processes such as metacognition. So people's ability to evaluate on their own abilities and behaviors. And so I'm interested in investigating that both behaviorally and with EEG, so looking what the neural correlates are of our abilities to self-evaluate. And I'm also very interested in the relevance that our metacognitive abilities have for our everyday lives. So for instance, there's quite a lot of evidence now that people's self-reflection is quite closely linked to their mental health. So individuals who have specific problems with their mental health tend to show systematic sort of biases and distortions of their self-reflection. So that's become sort of my primary research interest in recent times. So I'm interested in exploring that link between metacognition and mental health further, and also trying to look at what the neural correlates, what are the brain regions and the neural activity that's actually involved in our ability to self-evaluate.
So I would assume you completed a bachelor's in psychology or like a relevant field.
Yeah.
Or how did it all start out for you?
Yeah, I did my undergrad in psychology at Glasgow University. And I went on and did a master's and a PhD in psychology, and again, both of those were in Glasgow. And after my PhD, I did a postdoc position with my PhD supervisor in Glasgow, and then after doing that for 2 or 3 years, I got the job here in Dundee in 2019. So I started. This is my first lectureship.
When you started at Glasgow University at your bachelor's, did you have any idea what you wanted to go into, or was it kind of just, I'm interested in psychology, let me find out what this is?
Yeah, when I started studying psychology, my plan and what I aimed to do was to go on and become a clinical psychologist, which is the case for many many individuals who are studying undergraduate psychology. So I was very interested, even before I came into to university, I was very interested in sort of abnormal psychology and how to explain these kind of states, these unfortunate states that people find themselves in terms of mood and psychotic episodes and things like that. So I was sort of fascinated by it, and reading about it, realized that not much is known about how these things happen. So I was very interested to get into that field and to help people who had these sort of issues. So when I first came to uni, that was my plan. And as I did my undergraduate, I think it was around about third year that I started to think about other options. And it was mainly driven by sort of becoming exposed to, through the undergraduate course, different fields of psychology research, and just sort of having my eyes open to the different possibilities that maybe to make a positive impact in terms of furthering our knowledge about, for instance, abnormal psychology. Becoming an actual therapist was not the only avenue for that. So yeah, around about third year, I started to get very interested in some of the research that was going on in Glasgow and started to get involved in it. And then when I went on and did my dissertation in fourth year, and really enjoyed that, I started to think seriously about the possibility of going into more of a research-focused career. And at the same time, I was a little bit, when I looked into the sort of the steps necessary to become a clinical psychologist, and I was a little bit kind of worried at that time that I wouldn't be so competitive to get onto the clinical doctorate. I don't know in hindsight whether that's true or not, but that was part of the thing that swayed me towards wanting to pursue research, at least for a little while, because I had heard, we were told that it took many years for most individuals to be accepted onto clinical doctorate, even after their undergrad. So yeah, this combination of having a little bit of a worry about that, plus becoming engaged and interested in the research, it kind of ended up swaying me towards applying for PhD funding to do a research PhD.
When you started looking at that, did you also did you just have the idea that you wanted to maybe do some research and figure out what you want to do next, or did you also have like the idea that you might become a lecturer at some point? Was that like a part of the thought process at all, or was it a consideration?
Yeah, I think when I started my PhD, I was still very much thinking that I wanted to see how it went, but I still had the idea that maybe this would also be good experience to get for a few years and potentially go back towards the more clinical route. So for sure, I'd probably not at any stage during my PhD was I sort of dead certain that I was going to go on and become a lecturer, because many people who do PhDs don't necessarily stay on that kind of academic track. I think once I was like at the end of my PhD and starting my postdoc, probably at that stage when I was thinking more about the possibilities, and it was at that stage that I think really becoming a lecturer was more like of a serious thought in my head, yeah, when the opportunity came up a couple of years into my postdoc to take the position at Dundee, it seemed really exciting to me, so I went for it. So yeah, I don't know exactly when that became the plan, but I think, yeah, if you get heavily enough into the research sort of avenue, the possibility to keep doing it kind of depends on, you know, you can't stay a PhD student forever and you can't stay a postdoc forever. So the natural step is to then go on and become, to try and get a lectureship. So that kind of becomes a natural progression if you stay in the research domain.
Do you think you would want to go back or try to get back into clinical psychology one day? Is that like something that you would want to look forward to, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly trying to, my research is going in that direction. So I'm very interested at the moment in developing collaborations with clinical colleagues to do research focused on, research that's relevant for psychopathology and mental health. I think in terms of myself moving over to a clinical route, and out of academia, for instance, I don't have any plan to do that at the moment. So I'm not sure that that's super likely, but I can never say definitely. My research is moving in that direction, so I'm trying to develop closer links with clinical colleagues.
Yeah. How did you become specifically interested in metacognition? I know it has a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of links with, for example, bipolar disorder and other abnormal psychology. But how, like, I've never really heard of metacognition before I started talking to you, so I'm kind of interested in how that came about.
Yeah. So I became interested in it kind of first of all through the experiences, kind of anecdotal experiences that I was having when I was doing my own research during my PhD. So basically all of the experiments that I did, and I did experiments, some of them with healthy individuals and some of them with clinical groups, for instance, stroke patients. And when I was doing experiments, normally we would ask the participants to do some sort of task, often like a visual psychophysics task. And what we were interested in was, their actual performance, like were they able to do this task? What was the brain activity associated with performing the task? But when I spoke to the participants often, just when I was running these experiments, I would speak to them and talk to them about how they would tell me how they felt they performed on the task. And something that started to strike me after a couple of years in these conversations was what people were telling me in terms of how they thought they performed was very often not matching their actual performance, which I was able to check when I looked at the data. And this was true. I mean, this was well known, for instance, in stroke patients. Many stroke patients develop quite severe impairments. In particular, we were looking at visual impairments. And often these patients, some of them have good insight about this, like they're aware of their impairments, other ones don't. So even when they have quite severe impairments, if you ask them, they can't tell you about those impairments, which is quite a strange situation, but that's quite well known. But what's less well known and what I was seeing was that even in the healthy young participants, I was seeing often this quite large mismatch between how they felt they performed and how they actually performed. And so this wasn't part of those experiments at the time. I was sort of just speaking to them off the record. But this got me interested, and it got me wondering about how there could be this mismatch in like an apparently healthy person who was performing the task very well, for instance. Why were they coming to me and apologizing and saying that they felt they were guessing and they tried their hardest, but they think they were really bad? So that sort of piqued my interest, and then I started to sort of see this literature emerging, specifically looking at this phenomena, which was called metacognition, and this was broadly fit what I was sort of thinking about here, was this people's ability to self-reflect and to report on how they were performing versus how they were actually performing. And I thought the literature was super interesting. So people in the last 10 or 15 years have developed very nice ways of actually incorporating this kind of self-evaluation into psychophysical experiments, basically with confidence ratings. So whatever task you're doing, you ask the performance to make their decision about a stimulus. And then after they make that decision, you add an additional question, which is how confident are you that your decision was correct? And people, psychologists and psychophysicists had sort of developed very nice ways of quantifying the degree to which people's confidence in their decisions actually matched their objective performance. So this had all been happening, and I became familiar with this literature, and I became excited to incorporate these kind of methods into my own experiments. And it was fairly easy because I had been doing all these experiments with visual psychophysical tasks. It was very simple to just slightly adapt them and introduce these confidence ratings, and then have this whole other, as well as looking at their objective performance and potentially the neural correlates of their performance. We now had these other additional measures of their metacognitive performance, and so I became quite sort of more excited visual part. And yeah, over the last, I would say, 3 years or so since I started to incorporate the confidence decisions, that became the primary focus of the studies. And yeah, the literature which has been emerging had been using these new sort of quantitative methods of metacognition and linking it to sort of these interesting aspects such as mental health, but also other things such as people's personality traits and things like that.
How does that kind of happen? Like you mentioned, it's kind of like an emerging field, and a lot of new things are being done. How does that kind of occur? Like, how does the collaboration occur? Like, someone develops a new experiment, someone develops a new way of measuring something, and then how does that kind of travel around in the academic or like the academic circles? Because I've always wondered, like, how, like, when things are emerging, how do you know that someone else is working on it? Because if they publish a paper, it doesn't come out until like, you know, way after they already finished it. So how does that happen?
Absolutely. Yeah, sometimes, often it happens because you only do find out when the papers are published. And like you say, unfortunately, often that's quite a delayed process. Now there's kind of nice steps or nice things emerging which aid the process, such as preprints, which is where a lot of authors, they don't wait for the final accepted journal article. When they've done a study, they actually make initial drafts of the write-up available on online servers. So they put them up there before they've been peer reviewed and accepted in a journal. And that's helpful because that can mean that the world has access to what they're doing potentially years or 1 or 2 years at least before the final journal article. Apart from the papers, it often comes through seeing work presented at conferences. So many academics go to conferences relevant to their field, and they will, whether it's through a poster or through an oral presentation, they discuss the projects that they're currently working on, even if they only have preliminary data or they don't have the full results. So that's often been one of the most utilized ways of trying to keep up to date with new developments in a certain field. But certainly for me, becoming familiar with that literature was through the papers. So I was finding papers which had been out maybe for a few years even. So it wasn't like massively cutting edge and new, but it was new in terms of my awareness of what was possible in the field. So yeah, I sort of mixed my own anecdotal experience of speaking to participants and becoming interested in this phenomenon with then having my attention drawn to these things which had popped up in the literature over the last few years.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, because I always wondered, like, how does it get? Because I've talked to in the other interviews and just in general, I've heard that like getting published takes quite a while. So I always wonder, like, it's overall just quite a like delayed process, I guess, or like yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's kind of it's a source of frustration, I think, and it's not. In some ways, it's kind of an accident of history from how the publishing system has worked for decades and even centuries. We still are somehow attached to that, but we don't need to be, because the technology these days allows for much faster kind of dissemination of results. And obviously, we can see an interesting example with the situation with COVID and the development of the science around the vaccines. They have taken, in many regards, like cut out the full normal process of, at least in terms of disseminating the results. So, they were making the results from these trials known to the press and to the world prior to even having the final data set and prior to having peer review and publication. And it just shows you what is possible. So yeah, typically there can be a lag of having the final analysis done and the results ready. From that point to the final publication, that can be months, and it can even be years in some cases, because of the process being quite slow. I would actually add that another thing that facilitates this, that I've certainly noticed, is social media. So actually, a lot of the new findings that come to my attention now come to my attention through Twitter, and that includes new papers, but it also includes scientists sharing unpublished results on Twitter. And so I actually, social media can be like extremely useful for keeping up with like developments in your literature.
I've seen people, like academics, post questions on there as well about, for example, statistics or, you know, different methods of doing things. So I didn't really consider that. But yeah, I've definitely seen that as well. And also, I've seen a lot of PhD students kind of out their frustrations
Yeah.
on Twitter as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I would recommend if any students that are interested in pursuing like a master's or PhD or a career in research or academia, if you have a presence on Twitter, even if you don't want to yourself be particularly active, it's very useful for following people who are working in fields that you're interested in. And like you say, at different levels, from like the top kind of famous superstar professors down to junior faculty and PhD students. It's very, it can be very sort of eye-opening and give you a good idea of what's going on. And certainly for me, it's how most papers that come to my attention now come to my attention through Twitter.
Yeah, there's actually a question as well about someone asked that, given you received your PhD quite recently, do you have any advice for PhD candidates? So anyone who's looking to do a PhD, like what should they be considering? For example, funding as well.
Mm-hmm. I think if you're thinking about a PhD, then one of the most important things to do is to take a bit of time to consider what the topic, what sort of content would you be interested in doing a PhD on, and then once you have something, if you have something that you feel you're very interested in and passionate about, it's worth doing a little bit of research to look at the labs or the PIs, like the professors or lecturers who are running labs that do that type of research. So, and then I would recommend, have a look at the sort of papers that they're publishing. But again, if you can follow them on social media, you can follow the people in their lab, and also don't be afraid to contact these people. So when I was first starting to think about doing a PhD and to apply for funding, it was between third and fourth year of my undergrad, and I had some ideas of topics that I would really wanted to be doing research on, and I just sort of tried to have a look around at what the most appropriate labs would be for that, and I started writing emails to the lab heads, because that's what I was encouraged to do by like my supervisor at the time. And it was great because I think mostly all of them that I wrote to were responsive, and they were happy to have someone contact them in that way. And some of them were extremely helpful in pointing out appropriate sources that I should apply to potentially for funding. And even those ones who were unable to take on students were putting me in touch with other colleagues who they thought would be appropriate and things like that. So yeah, definitely don't be afraid to reach out in that way. Like, don't feel like it's rude to have this. Yeah, sorry.
Were you quite specific when you were asking, or were you kind of just more general? I find this area interesting. I find what you're doing interesting. Or were you giving like exact kind of almost proposals at that point?
No, it was quite general at that point for sure. I was just telling them what I was interested in, and what was the sort of work that had led me to that, and not huge long emails either, just short emails. And so some of them I ended up having sort of like back and forth correspondence with. So we ended up talking about quite a lot. But yeah, for sure, don't worry. You don't need to have like anything like an advanced proposal at that stage. It's just about reaching out to try and start to develop like contacts that might be useful. I think the earlier that you do that, for sure, the better. Just because, well, one of the main reasons being that, yeah, the deadlines for like funding opportunities, I mean, there's various funding opportunities, but the deadlines often come much earlier than would be ideal, So if you're thinking about PhD sort of third year and start of fourth year, it's definitely worth at that stage starting to explore the possibilities and getting in touch with potential supervisors and finding out when the submission deadlines are. There's many different opportunities and they're different in terms of funding, and they're different in different countries. So it's kind of hard to give like a general piece of advice, but like in the UK, for instance, the government research councils, so like the Economic and Social Research Council funds a lot of psychology PhDs. Sometimes the Medical Research Council, and then there's charities like the Wellcome Trust who fund a lot of PhD research. So it's worth looking into these opportunities because they're sort of like the most mainstream ways that people end up getting funding for PhDs.
What do you think they look for in a proposal? Like if you're thinking about the UK, like what do you think is like something that's kind of a standout, thing that people can do in their proposal?
Yeah, I think for the proposals, once you potentially have identified like a lab which you would be excited to work in and that might be that is looking to take on PhD students, I would work with the supervisor or the potential supervisor. Hopefully they will work with you to try and develop a proposal that will be exciting. And of course, it will differ from sort of supervisor to supervisor how much time or how much effort they're going to put into that. But the sort of things that they're looking for when it's a PhD proposal, a lot of weight will go on the record of the candidate themselves. So their academic like degree classification or expected degree classification. So of course, having like good grades is going to be extremely helpful. And having, for instance, things on your CV such as research experience, potentially during your undergrad, like set outside of the main curriculum, if you've been volunteering in a lab, if you've had summer scholarships, for instance, those are very positive things on a PhD proposal. And then in terms of the projects, they're looking for something which is has to be feasible. So being over ambitious, which can be the case if, for instance, if a student is doing it all by themselves, they might not know what is and isn't possible, or how long things are likely to take. So that's where there's certainly a proposed supervisor should hopefully come in very helpful. And then it's the content of the proposal is difficult to give general advice about. Because it will be different from sort of field to field and topic to topic. But usually they're looking for something which is fairly novel and that can potentially have some sort of potential impact on if you can make an argument that this research being conducted is likely to be important for outside of the very narrow sort of academic area that it's in. That it's a big advantage for the proposals if they can show that they can potentially have that kind of impact.
Just kind of putting it into context and like making what can actually come from this.
Exactly, yeah. But it is a difficult thing, I think, at that stage. When I was applying for a PhD, I was lucky enough to have I did have support from my undergrad supervisor of my dissertation, and they were very helpful when we sort of developed the idea together. So that if you can have those sorts of discussions with a potential supervisor, it's very useful. But obviously, some students applying for PhDs don't have that kind of opportunity. The other possibility, though, for applying for PhDs is that some PhD projects secure funding before they have a candidate. So some supervisors or labs, they themselves propose a PhD project which the funding body can accept to fund. And then once they have the funding, they actually advertise for the students to apply. So in that scenario, the student doesn't have to develop the proposal. those sorts of opportunities you can find. They're normally advertised, for instance, on findaphd.com. So anyone who's thinking about PhD should keep an eye on that. And in that scenario, yeah, they will have like a sort of open competition where people apply, and they might have interviews and things to see who gets the position, and then whoever gets the funding, they will carry out this project, which has already been sort of planned out.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot. That was one of the questions someone asked. That's why I was kind of curious about it as well. What's something that students at Dundee don't learn in psychology? So someone in the undergraduate degree that they should learn about, but they don't really have much lectures or classes or anything on.
That's a good question. So there's there's definitely, like in my experience of coming through a psychology undergraduate and then doing a master's and a PhD and going through that whole process, definitely there's things that I learned simply through experience of starting to conduct research and sort of seeing behind the curtain as I was going through my PhD that were very eye-opening and certainly were not taught. But I'm not sure how they could be very easily taught, and I don't know to what degree that it was sort of specific to my own experience or, versus being very generalizable. I mean, I think there are issues with sort of bad practices in research, which we are trying to bring into the curriculum more. And actually at Dundee now, we touch on them a little bit, I think, in a few of the different modules at different levels. In terms of questionable research practices and sort of things that have been wrong with the system of performing and publishing research. And for me, I never got taught any of that undergrad, and I think for a long time it just wasn't talked about, and there was no attempts to address these kind of things. But now, and that was part of the most eye-opening stuff that I saw as I started to do research. The whole things about it being very, even if you conduct a study very well, if you have a null result or a negative effect, it's very hard to publish, and or it has been historically, and that's a big problem because it creates publication bias, and a lot of the stuff that does get published proves to be very difficult to replicate. And that's a problem for many, many reasons, but it's actually a big problem for junior sort of academics, especially because, if you do a PhD where you try to follow up on an effect in the literature, if that effect was published from a study which was badly conducted and used some of these questionable practices, and so it's not a reliable effect, people's careers can be ruined in some instances because they can spend many years trying to follow up an effect that doesn't exist. And because it's not easy to identify why they can't replicate it, many people just become very frustrated, and it can lead to them, having a very stressful PhD, for instance, and leaving academia. So there's all sorts of very negative, direct and indirect consequences of some of the things that have been accepted in research previously. And certainly,
do you feel a change? Yeah. Do you feel a change in the field happening?
Yeah, for sure. There's in my own experience, there's way more people talking about it openly now than when I started my PhD in 2010, for instance. And from speaking to more senior academics, these things were not talked about at all 20 years ago. They were basically just swept under the carpet. And yeah, I think some of the newer generation of academics are trying to force this into the curriculum, because I think it is important that undergrads are taught about this. And, I would ideally have it taught even more than it is now, but I think we're doing, in terms of comparison with other places, we're doing a fairly good job of trying to make students aware of these kind of things. So yeah, I guess I'm not sure what other things undergrad students at Dundee are missing out on in terms of psychology.
What about outside, like, I guess the classroom, what would you call it, outside the lecture hall? Like, what kind of, not jobs, but what kind of work should a psychology student look for in, during the undergraduate, or how do you think they could best prepare for a career in either, with psychology and research or psychology and therapy? What do you think they could, because it is quite difficult to get a job in psychology without, credentials, or any kind of like, background. So what do you think their best steps?
Yeah, I think for certain quite prescribed routes, so like as an example for the clinical route, students who are in the position of whether you're in first year or fourth year, if it is still your goal to pursue clinical psychology, there are certain opportunities in terms of volunteering and getting involved with different organizations, which are going to be very, very beneficial for as you move forward. And in fact, it's when if you to become like a practicing clinical psychologist in the UK, you have to do the clinical psychology doctorate. And that's quite competitive to get onto. So that's the thing that I mentioned earlier, where sometimes it takes quite a few years, even after your undergraduate, for people to be accepted onto it. I mean, not for everybody, but for some people. And I think the people who are making the decisions about that, of course, they're interested in people's academic record, but they're almost equally interested in whether the person has relevant experience of working, for instance, with disadvantaged groups. Whether it's patients in terms of clinical groups, whether it's, for instance, homeless charities. There's all sorts of organizations that if you are working with them and getting experience of working with vulnerable people, that's exactly the sort of experience that the committees making decisions about clinical psychology, they want to see that type of experience. So definitely, and I think any students who kind of want to know more about that, if that is their goal, like the career service here at the University of Dundee is very, very good and have a lot of experience working with students who want to go on and pursue specific paths in psychology, whether it's clinical or educational or occupational. I would encourage anyone who wants to discuss these things to contact and make an appointment with the career service, because they will know all the relevant local organizations, and they've seen many students sort of go along that path before. And in terms of a sort of more research focused career, yeah, as I mentioned, just getting involved in research in any capacity, whether it's volunteering and working as a research assistant here in the department in Dundee, or with any other research organizations, becoming involved in the process of data collection and analysis and all these things that are involved in research. If you have any experience with that, then it's going to be a positive thing on your CV when you come to, for instance, apply for PhDs and things.
Okay. Do you have any, just before we end, any advice or I guess suggestions for like first and second year students? Because this has definitely been a rough start to university, I would say, with COVID and everything. So do you have any advice for them, just for their well-being, psychology?
Yeah, I think it's very important to try and maintain a sense of like attachment or community. And I think that's one of the things that we've lost to COVID that's most difficult to make up for. So, like in first year, for instance, a huge part of the university experience traditionally has, as well as sort of getting to grips with the academic side of things, it's been to try and make new friends and become involved in different social circles and things, and it's difficult to maintain that. Whereas we can replace the lectures and things with online classes, but I think it's a bit more difficult. So I think I would encourage students to try to participate in what opportunities they have, even if they don't seem as exciting as the real world in-person opportunities would be. And I know that like the student union have been trying to organize online events and things. And yeah, as things hopefully get start to get back to something more like normal life, I hope those students who have sort of unfortunately, missed out on some of these opportunities at the very beginning of their academic career, as things start to get back to normal and as the sort of restrictions on everyday life start to reduce, I would try as much as they can to get involved in things. And even if they've had a sort of negative experience or a bad time at the beginning, that as things get back to normal, it might be possible to very quickly turn it around and get more involved in the sort of university life that people have been more used to in the past. So don't give up if you've had a difficult start through all the online learning and stuff. I would encourage people to stick with it, and hopefully as things move forward now, things are only going to get better with regard to that.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview as well. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
And for anyone listening as well, please make sure to check our socials again and check our the Instagram stories as well, because we do ask you to ask questions. And thank you to everyone who is asking questions. They're really great.